All right, so for the first 30 seconds or so of this video, we'll end up with no audio because this is coming from a police officer's body cam recording. I believe this is Corporal British in this case. And after he activates the cameras, when the audio will start, but they record for about 30 seconds before they are activated.
Your number right now. Little egg, I'm gonna be on a male subject. Radio by Redress. Why you giving me the finger? What? What's your problem? What? Why you giving me the finger?
I'm walking away.
Huh?
Am I free to go?
Why you giving me the finger?
Am I free to go?
No. Come here.
All right, so at this point, this young man does seem to actually have a basic understanding of what he should be doing in any interaction with the police. He asked the officer if he's free to go. The officer said no, which means at this point it is no longer a consensual encounter, whether or not this police officer has reason to be detaining him for giving him the middle finger, which we'll talk about here in a minute, I'm sure. He has indicated that this kid is not free to go and therefore is being detained at this point.
What reason?
Why you giving me the finger?
I'm free to go. Am I free to go?
What's your problem?
Am I free to go?
No.
What, do you have a problem?
No.
You have a problem?
No.
You don't have a problem, then I can leave.
Why you giving me the finger when you're walking? Huh? Come here.
I'm free to go.
No,
I
you're
can
not.
walk.
Get over here.
What?
Get over here.
Why?
Because.
Is that a lawful order?
Yeah.
For what reason?
Because you're giving me the finger.
Okay, so a few things right here that I think are extremely important to note. First, if an officer is telling you that you are not free to go, even if you don't believe that they have any reason to be stopping you in the first place, you do need to stop. And in some jurisdictions, it could be considered resisting without violence or some of those kinds of things. So there's really no reason to escalate at this point. Although this young man did do a great job of saying, well, if you don't have a problem, then I'm just going to leave. This officer didn't respond. But he has stated at several different points that this kid is not free to go. Now, this leads us into the bigger question, which is flicking someone off considered free speech, or can it be considered a crime? And when we're talking about the First Amendment, it protects virtually all speech, short of something that is an incitement to violence or something that could literally cause harm to people. And the example that we hear here all the time is yelling fire in a crowded theater. And while the act of yelling fire in a crowded theater, assuming that there is a fire, would be protected, doing it to cause a disturbance and doing it to cause people to get up and run around would be something that's not considered to be free speech. The other exception you'll hear mentioned a lot of times comes from a Supreme Court case, Texas versus Johnson, and this would be what is referred to as the fighting words doctrine. This would be something that's a direct insult or an invitation to fight. Something like, come get some, or do you want some, or I'm going to beat you up, right? All of those things would be considered fighting words and wouldn't necessarily be considered protected speech. Now, in this case, this kid wasn't using words to begin with, he was using gestures. And so we have to dig a little bit deeper. Generally speaking, the Supreme Court and the way that the First Amendment has been interpreted since its inception is that you don't have to use words to exercise your freedom of speech. It includes things like demonstrations, artistic expression, some of those kinds of things are included. And so even if we're talking about this as expression itself and not speech, that then leads us to the question of, is using the middle finger considered to be protected speech? And under Texas versus Johnson, gestures or symbols themselves cannot be considered fighting words. So simply giving somebody the middle finger cannot be considered fighting words or a disturbance of the peace. And additionally, in a district court case that would actually cover this particular jurisdiction in New Jersey, Corey versus Nason, using the middle finger towards a police officer is protected expression. Additionally, Durian versus the City of Douglas holds that an officer lacks any probable cause to stop a person simply for giving them obscene gestures or obscene words directed at the officer, which is exactly what we are talking about here in this case. One last piece of very important case law here would be Sandul versus Larian, and even the use of the F word in public cannot be considered criminal conduct. And so when we're taking a look at what's going on in this situation, not only should this be considered protected speech in general, but it's especially considered protected speech when it's directed at a government official, a police officer, a politician, something like that. You get even more leeway under the fighting words doctrine and with your expression of your freedom of speech under the First Amendment when it's directed at a public official, like what was held in Durian versus the city of Douglas.
That's legal.
No, it isn't.
Says who?
Says it all.
Pull up the law.
Huh?
Pull up the law.
What's your name?
What's the law?
What's your
What's
name?
the law?
What's your name? How
What's the
old
law?
are you?
I appreciate it. Have a good one.
Pig.
Fucking pig.
Whatever.
Fuck you.
What?
You heard me. What,
Come here.
I'm afraid of you?
Come here. Get over here. Get over here.
What?
Get over here.
I'm not doing anything illegal.
Yeah, you are. You just cursed me off.
That's
Turn
not a
around.
crime.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so as we discussed a few minutes ago, swearing at a police officer, swearing at a government official, in and of itself, giving them the bird, any of those kinds of things, cannot be considered a crime. It is considered protected speech under the First Amendment, based on all of the case law that we were talking about previously.
It is.
Says who?
Says me.
Says who?
Turn around.
Okay, this I think is where I have the biggest problem with this video. The young man here is asking the police officer who is considering this a crime. Based on what law are you talking about? And the police officer says, based on me, right? He says, swearing is a crime according to me. Obviously, it's the job of law enforcement officers to enforce the law and not their feelings. And the real question here is, would any reasonable person think that flipping somebody off is a crime? And the answer to that is no, regardless of your moral position on profanity, obscene gestures, any of those kinds of things. No one that is a rational human being would think that this should be considered a crime.
Turn around. Come on.
Bro, that is not a fucking crime.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
Why are you cursing me?
It's not a crime.
What's your name?
It's not a crime.
What's your name?
Help! Help!
No help.
Help! Help!
Yo,
Help!
Okay, so at this point, the initiating officer, the corporal that initiated this involuntary interaction, this detention with this young man, turns off his body camera, which is not only a department policy violation, but it's actually a Title 40A violation under the New Jersey statutes because he has no legitimate reason for turning it off. The only possible reason that you could have for turning your body camera off at this point is to not record the interaction or what's happening. And unfortunately, we have no idea what's happening between now and when the second officer arrives on the scene. But there's zero legitimate reason for him to have turned this off. And like I said, it's a department policy violation and violation of New Jersey Title 40A, which governs the use of body-worn cameras. Again, here we're going to have about 20 to 30 seconds of video with no audio because, as I mentioned earlier, body cams are essentially always recording, but they'll save the 30 seconds before they are turned on once they are activated.
Got a picture out. Okay.
Under arrest right now because I was cursing at him. And he said,
You're being detained. Because you're acting strange.
what? That's not legal.
Okay, so now this officer has changed the reason why this young man is being detained to saying that he is acting strange, which is not a reason to detain someone. And the expression of your rights, whether recording in public, flicking off a police officer, simply walking down the street, is not something that any rational person would consider to be acting strange. And what he's alluding to here is something that they're going to cover a little bit later, which is the community caretaking function in massive air quotation marks. So if you do see someone that is truly behaving strange, They may initiate a consensual interaction with that person to see if they're having some sort of mental health crisis, something like that. In this case, this officer knows darn well that the only reason that he's detained this kid is because he had his feelings hurt by this kid flipping him the bird.
Legal.
It is legal. He's allowed to
Who is
detain
this
you
kid?
until he performs his
So what am I
investigation.
doing though? What am I doing that made him detain me?
Okay, so this second officer just arrived on the scene and he said it's legal for him to detain you until he completes his investigation. The only time it is legal for a police officer to detain you is if they have reasonable articulable suspicion that you have committed, are going to commit, or are thinking about committing a crime, right? So there's three situations. You either already did it, you're thinking about doing it, or they think that you're doing it right in this minute. And none of those things are happening here. This officer, if he doesn't know, he should know, because there is a ton of case law surrounding the ability to say pretty much anything you want or express pretty much anything you want to your government officials. It's one of the massive things that's granted to us under the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment of the Constitution. He should know that this speech is covered. Therefore, he does not have reasonable articulable suspicion that this kid is or is about to commit a crime.
What legal
Every
right?
time I rode by him twice, he shot me the finger. So I turned around and say, "Well, you
Is that a crime?
No problem."
Hold
Then
on
he
a
tells
second.
me
That's not a
This is
crime.
causing public disturbance.
And then he
That's
tells
not-
me to
no, that's not a
to
crime.
F off, pig.
Yeah, fuck off, big.
Okay, so at this point, both officers are kind of ganging up on this kid, and they said, cursing is a public disturbance. And as we discussed, constitutionally protected activity, filming in public, expressing yourself, protesting, redressing your government for your grievances, all of those things are considered protected speech and cannot be the basis of a public disturbance, right? You simply filming someone in public where you have the right to do it, you saying what this kid has said several different times to this officer at this point, these things cannot be considered a public disturbance because they are covered under the First Amendment. Additionally, because they are in the state of New Jersey has a very specific code. And essentially what they say in their public disturbance law is that what should be considered a public disturbance is engaging in fighting or threatening behavior or violent and tumultuous behavior, or creating dangerous condition that serves no legitimate purpose, right? The subsection of that statute that they're trying to apply to this is that they have a little carve out for offensive language when it is used to offend people within hearing distance in reckless disregard for them. Now, the constitutionality of that part of the statute as applied to the public in general would be a different question, but in this case, it's not in reckless disregard for anything. It is a political statement to his government, which is covered under the First Amendment and all of the case law that we talked about previously.
That's not a crime. That's not a crime. He's looking at you because he's like, what the fuck you want me to do? Because it's not a crime. I know my rights.
Who are you?
I don't have to say any of that.
You do if you're being detained.
What's that?
You do if you're being detained.
For what reason?
What does
legal
mean?
reason am I being detained for?
Okay, so this officer is again misstating the law, and it seems that this young man has a much better grasp of both constitutional understanding about expressing his rights and New Jersey statute. Essentially, what the police officers are trying to imply at this point is that this kid must stop and identify since he's being detained. First of all, New Jersey is not a stop and identify state, and even if they were, the detaining officer would have to have reasonable articulable suspicion that this kid has or is about to commit a crime, which, as we've discussed previously, he has not. New Jersey is not a stop and identify statute state, and as such, this kid cannot be required to give over his identification even when he has been legally detained, which in this case, the ground here is pretty darn shaky for this detention to begin with. Additionally, and I'm sure they're going to bring this up here, they're going to say, hey, you're obstructing our investigation, something like that, if he refuses to identify. And under Bryant versus Camden County, the state of New Jersey has said your refusal to identify cannot be considered obstruction. It cannot be an impediment to any of the investigation unless you are driving a car, which obviously this kid clearly wasn't because this interaction started on the side of the road.
Where are you coming from and where are you
What
going?
legal reason am I being detained for? I need to know that. Legally, I need to know that.
Why are you
Shooting me the finger.
Why are you
Is that illegal?
Why are you
Cursing at
flipping the bird? Yes, it is. It's causing a public disturbance and a public alarm if you are cursing
So
in
a
public.
single one.
So when you are cursing in public, you are causing a public disturbance. You're being a nuisance to the public.
In what way? When he was driving past? That's singular. That's singular. Well, I'd like to see you guys prove it in court.
It's called causing a public disturbance.
Okay, so again, they're referring back to the public disturbance law in New Jersey, right? This is 100% protected speech. There's not even a question about this, regardless of the state that you live in. We have the right, whether you agree with the profanity side of this or not, to address our grievances to a government. And police officers specifically have been called out several different times in several different Supreme Court cases as needing to be able to withstand escalated levels of criticism, such as people swearing at them, flipping them off, all of those kinds of things. So no, this officer is 100% in the wrong here, and the kid, regardless of whether you agree with his attitude or not, is 100% in the right.
I know the law.
By being a nuisance.
I know the law.
All right. So at that point, what he is doing is he's not saying you're being charged with anything. At that
I'm
point,
just
he's
figuring out
detaining
what's wrong
you
with you.
to make
What's
sure that
going
there
on?
is nothing
Make
wrong.
sure you're okay.
Make sure that you're okay.
What reason does he need to detain me?
He thought maybe he thought you were signaling him down. I'm not sure.
That I was doing what?
Were
I
you
wasn't.
Okay, so I can't make a rational argument for what the police officers are thinking at this point. They know they have this kid detained. They know they shouldn't have this kid detained. And now they're essentially trying to bring in the community caretaking doctrine that we talked about a little bit previously to say, hey, he should be checking you out just to make sure you're okay, because it's really weird that you flicked off a police officer for no reason. Obviously, that would never hold up in court. No one in their right mind would think that. But this is the justification that they're trying to use in order to get this kid to give over his ID.
Signaling to him?
No,
Listen, I was
no,
just-
you knew very well that I wasn't signaling to you, right? I wasn't signaling
Well,
to you.
you bring attention to yourself.
That's not signaling.
You're acting strange. I'm making sure you're okay.
Dude, that's so funny. Like, you're not here for my safety. You're not trying to protect
How
me.
do you know?
You're walking
may
on the
be-
side of the road and you're cursing and you're flipping the bird.
Once at him. I gave him the finger once. That
you know
will
him?
not hold up.
Do you know him?
That will not hold
Why
up
are
in
you
a
giving
court
him
of
the
law.
finger?
That will not hold up in a court of
Why
law.
are you giving
I
him
know
the
my
finger?
rights.
Do you know him?
It's not your business.
Do you know him?
It's not your business. I
It is
plead
my
the fifth.
business.
I plead the fifth then.
Yeah.
You guys make nothing out of
So,
something.
by you cursing and using vulgar gestures is
So what's
causing
the
a
First
public
Amendment for?
is causing a public disturbance.
What's
and a
the
public
First
alarm.
Amendment for?
Okay. The First Amendment is for your freedom of speech. Okay.
Okay.
What does that have to do with
Was I
using
making a call
gestures?
to action? Was I?
Okay, so at this point, it's extremely obvious that this young man knows way more about the First Amendment than either of these two officers, and he knows his rights substantially better than these officers know their own rights and or the law that governs the state of New Jersey and police interactions. As we discussed previously, there are a huge number of Supreme Court precedents, including the ones that we discussed above, like Corey versus Nason, which I believe is actually a district or a federal court case rather than a Supreme Court precedent. But speech and expression are considered to be what is covered under the freedom of speech, right? Burning a flag is considered the use of your speech. That would obviously be an expression in the same way that flicking off a police officer is an expression.
Was I making a call to action? Was I? Was I like
When you were
threatening
acting-
you in any way?
what are you
Did I
talking
threaten
about?
you?
Do you
You
understand?
know what a
your-
call to action is?
Do you
It's called
understand that you're
encouragement.
acting-
Is that a call to action? Am
Do
I
you-
calling for an action to be done against you?
Do
No.
you understand
You're
that
bringing
it is?
attention to
Listen,
yourself to
listen,
get
listen, listen.
That's illegal.
It's behavior that's out of the ordinary.
I
okay?
understand how it works.
So
but
therefore,
legally
he stopped
it would not
to talk
hold.
to you. Clearly, if he stopped all the way back there, I'm assuming you guys were back there and you just
We
continued
went
to
back
walk.
a bit further
And you
back.
just continued to walk.
I wasn't running. I told you that I was free to go, and you all
I said
of a sudden.
stop, and you ran down here. That's
I
why
wasn't
ran up.
running. I was walking.
Once he
So
gives an
let's-
order
let's
for
be
you to
honest here.
stop, you're supposed to stop.
Okay, this is one place where I actually almost agree with this officer, where if you are being told to stop by a police officer, whether or not you believe that the detention is lawful, you should stop and finish that interaction because, at least in the mind of the officer, you are being detained. Whether or not they have a legal basis for detaining you at that point, whether or not they have reasonable articulable suspicion in your mind that you have committed a crime, if you are being told to stop by an officer, it means they have no longer given you the opportunity to have a consensual interaction. You are now being detained. You can fight that detention later, but as I mentioned a few minutes ago, you don't want to have that fight on the side of the road.
I did stop when he originally said it, but I was asking, is it
And then he
illegal?
told me
Is it
to
a
F
lawful
off,
order?
and he took off.
Yeah, because I kept walking because you weren't pursuing at the first. You
All
only
right.
started pursuing because
This young man does have a point here, although the officer did initially tell him to stop. After that first interaction, when he said, I'm going to go now. The officer didn't really say anything in response for a good 15, 20 seconds before he started kind of waddling after him.
I said, fuck you, pig. That's when you got a little upset.
Okay, so
he got his panties in the pants.
listen, we're here at this point now, okay? You've brought the attention to yourself, you've caused the public alarm.
Yep.
So now,
well, I'd like to see you legally hold that in court, because
I'm not charging you with anything, so I don't legally need to hold anything in court.
Well,
okay, what I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out why you're walking on the side of the road, okay? And why?
Okay, so this is one of the most frustrating things about this video. At this point, the officer knows that there is no reason to identify this kid. The only reason you would ever need to identify anyone legally is if you are detaining them with reasonable articulable suspicion that they have committed a crime. Now, many police departments do have a requirement for the officers that they try to obtain identification anytime that they're out on a call, and that obviously makes sense, right? They have the full ability to identify anybody that is willing to identify themselves. But as we've discussed previously, there's no reason this kid has to identify in this situation, because not only has he not broken the law, at least that we've seen so far in this video, other than potentially walking away from an officer that thought he was in a detention with this kid, but he has no obligation to identify in New Jersey when he's being detained, period.
You were continuing to signal to a police officer.
I wasn't signaling.
Okay.
See, now you changed the story. Now you're changing the story. Was I signaling, or which one was it?
So what were you doing?
Well, I want to know from your perspective. What was I
pulled up onto the scene, so you tell me what you were doing.
To bring you attention.
I plead the fifth. You fucking idiot. You're a fucking idiot, dude.
Okay.
How long have you been a cop? 6?
Longer than you.
Listen.
Longer than you? I'm not a cop, retard.
Listen.
How long have you been alive?
You're fucking retarded, bro.
Listen.
Yep.
What? Like, what? I don't understand what the point of this is.
I'm walking. That's what I'm doing.
Okay.
It's the Fourth Amendment to be allowed to walk without seizures or anything like that.
You
Which
sure?
is, yes.
Are you sure that's the Fourth Amendment?
That's the Fourth Amendment.
You sure that's what the Fourth Amendment is? You
You
sure?
want to bet money on it?
You sure that's what the Fourth Amendment? It gives you the right to walk.
Okay, so at this point, this second officer is just being straight up condescending to this kid. Although he didn't articulate this very well, the Fourth Amendment is one of the reasons that you have the right to travel unmolested. And it also includes the right to not be searched or seized unreasonably. In this case, what this kid is referring to is that he has been seized. And this officer is essentially saying, you know, that's utterly irrelevant. The Fourth Amendment has to do with searches and seizures. There's no seizure that is happening here. Well, unfortunately, he's yet again utterly wrong about the law here. One of the things that gives people the ability to stop, as we discussed earlier, is the reasonable articulable suspicion that comes from a Supreme Court case, Terry versus Ohio, that gives them the ability to stop someone and have this type of an interaction, right? The very basic thing to figure out whether or not they have committed a crime. At this point, like I said a minute ago, they've obviously admitted that he hasn't committed a crime because they said they're just here having a conversation, right? They're contradicting themselves over and over and over again. But if we also look at a case, U.S. versus Mendenhall, what the court decided in that case is that a seizure does occur whenever an officer uses physical force, which happened in this case. The initiating officer grabbed this kid by the arm, twisted it behind his back to try to gain control, or displays authority to detain the person. So the seizure of this young man's person began the second that the initiating officer said, no, you're not free to leave, and then escalated even further when he wrenched his arm behind his back. So yes, this kid, under the common understanding of the Fourth Amendment, has in fact been seized and has had his Fourth Amendment rights potentially violated in this case. Yet again, he's showing he has a much better grasp of not only New Jersey state law, but basic constitutional understanding than either of these two officers do.
Without seizure. What's going to be seizured while you're walking?
My body, my person, idiot.
I'm seizing you? Did anybody
Yes,
Did I
yes,
check all
you
your
were,
pockets
you were
or
about
anything?
to.
Come on.
And I knew that was coming. He said, I'm seizing you, I'm seizing you. That's exactly what U.S. versus Mendenhall addresses.
You were about to.
Listen.
He said I was going to be under arrest. He fucking said
He
it.
said you were
I
detained.
said stop.
He
No,
said you were
or you're
detained.
gonna be arrested.
So now what
Yeah,
happens?
so
now what happens?
he just admitted that
now
he was
what
going
happens
to
is when
arrest
he
me.
gives you a lawful order to stop, and you do
It
not
wasn't a
stop.
lawful order, though.
And you do not stop.
It legally was not a lawful
and you
order.
do not stop, then that becomes a criminal offense, and then yes, you can be put under
But
arrest.
it's not a lawful order. Then I take it to court, and then he'd get sued, and I get
Maybe.
punitive damages. I'd be rich as fuck. Is that what you want?
That
You don't know.
So this is actually the first time I kind of agree with this officer. I know I said that I think once before, but this is really the only place where they have any leg to stand on. And it's because when the initiating officer did say that he was not free to leave, he did begin to walk away. And as I said, whether or not you agree with the reason that they are stopping you, you should stop and follow through with the detention, one, you don't lose your rights that way. Yes, they are being violated, but you can solve that in court with a very simple lawsuit. And in this case, both of these officers would be likely to lose their qualified immunity because this is well-established case law that flicking off a police officer, cursing at a police officer, using profane language in public directed at a government official, all of those things are very well known to not be violations of any sort of profanity or state statute that governs the use of language. And so, yes, he has that to his advantage. However, if you are in a detention, depending on the state law, you have certain obligations. In New Jersey, he just has to basically not leave the scene. He's not obligated to give his identification, any of those kinds of things. But at the point where he is being detained, yes, he could be arrested. Would it be overturned in court later? Would it be thrown out? Any decent judge would throw any additional charges out, but then you still have to go to jail. You still get fingerprinted. They still run you through the ringer. And then you have to make that argument in court rather than just having the interaction that he's having now, showing these officers how silly it is that they're stopping him for this and then continuing on with the rest of his day. There is a potential, and the arrest would probably be legal. It's just a question of whether or not they could actually end up charging him after that point in time.
It may be what happens if you think that that's what's going to happen.
All right.
It may be what's going to happen. It may not be what happens. Okay?
Okay, I
What may
understand.
happen is
All right, so
is
what
you
are we
may get a
wasting time
normal
for?
jury.
Am I free to go?
What
Am I
may
free to
happen
go?
is you may get
Am I
a
free to
normal
go?
jury. No, because at this point
For what reason?
you were detained, okay, because he told you to stop
Okay.
and you didn't stop.
Okay.
So therefore, you need to identify yourself as a part of the investigation. So what is your name?
Okay, I'm gonna need all of your badge numbers.
I will give you everything written down on a card. I'll
What's
give it
your,
all.
what's
Okay, so this officer, yet again, is extremely uneducated on the law here. He at no point in New Jersey, whether they have detained him for walking away from the initial detainment, which is essentially the argument that they're making here, or not, this young man is under no obligation to identify in the state of New Jersey. It is not a stop and identify state. And to detain him to begin with, they would have to have that reasonable articulable suspicion that he has committed a crime, which we know over and over again at this point that he has not.
your rank?
I'll give it all to you
What's
on a
your
card.
rank?
Patrolman. I'm
What's
a
your rank?
patrolman. That's my rank. Patrolman.
Oh, patrolman.
Okay.
And you?
Corporal.
Okay.
Interesting.
So, what is your
I
name?
could give you.
If you have an ID,
Am I?
that's perfect.
Am I? Okay. I'll take it to court
If you have
because
an
this
ID,
is
that's
still
perfect.
this is still a detainment.
Are you a juvenile?
This is an illegal detainment,
Are
so
you
I
a
can still.
juvenile?
I'm not going to answer that.
You have to answer.
Why?
Because you're being detained.
I said I'll give you my ID, buddy.
Are you a juvenile?
Again, yet again, this officer does not seem to have a basic understanding of the law. He's not required to help an investigation in any way, one way or another.
You show me.
No. Okay, so
Better.
because it has to be handled a little bit differently.
We gotta
That's all.
handle
If you're a
juvenile.
juvenile, I have to call your parents and I have to advise them that I'm out with you and that I'm speaking
Go ahead,
with you.
Piggy.
That's all it is. Okay?
He's such a fucking pig, bro.
So what does that make you?
Not a pig.
What does
Dude,
that
this
make
is
you for
illegal.
saying?
This is illegal, buddy.
What is the point?
This is illegal.
There's nothing illegal about
Yes, it is.
It
You
is
want to bet
not.
money on it?
We're gonna find
We'll-
out.
we'll see in court, bud.
Listen,
Okay, yet again, despite the fact that you may not agree with this kid's language, he is right. This is not a legal detention under any definition of legal detention, right? There's zero reason for this to have started to begin with, and he is just stomping all over the knowledge that these two officers claim to have.
we're gonna find out. Okay.
We'll
When
see
you
in
cause
court.
a public disturbance and a public alarm and you become a nuisance to the public, okay?
You'll legally have to prove that I was a nuisance
When
to
you're
the public.
standing-
How will you do that? How will you do that? I just want to hear
Camera
your-
systems. Okay, so when he goes by in the car, okay, and he sees you
Okay.
doing what you're doing,
And what was
that's
I
all gonna
doing?
be there.
And what part of that caused a disturbance? That's what I'm trying to legally understand. I don't understand. Is that a body camera?
That's what it is.
Perfect, perfect. Tuckerton doesn't have them, you know that? Tuckerton's been on back order for months.
How do you know?
Because I have a lawsuit against them, that's why. And I wish they'd have fucking body cams. I would love if they had body cams. And it takes out the bad cop. That's what it's for. It's not for the good cop. It's for the bad cop. Well, to protect the good cops as well.
It's for all of
To
us.
take out the bad cops.
It's
I just wanted to pause this for a second and point out the irony of this kid hoping that body cameras would come to his aid and kick out bad cops when the corporal who initiated the stop to begin with had turned his camera off for a substantial portion of the interaction, specifically to avoid recording what was going on between him and the person he was unlawfully detaining.
for all of us.
Right.
It's for all of us. It's for everybody that's involved in the situation. Okay?
Appreciate it.
There you go. Okay. Now, listen, if you have any problems or anything, and you want to come down, you want to talk to somebody, our supervisors are always there as well. Okay?
Well, I'm gonna
And
take
you
a
can do
lawsuit.
that.
So who would I press criminal charges against?
For what?
You're gonna have to. You're gonna have to
police
call.
officers.
You're gonna have to call and figure that out with a lawyer.
I don't need to answer that. I'm asking you, where would I go to press charges against a police officer?
You would have to come down and file a complaint with
It's
the courts.
at this police station.
You would have to file a complaint with the courts.
Got it.
Okay, at this point, this is kind of where he's a little bit out of depth in terms of his knowledge of how this works. Unfortunately, it's virtually impossible to press criminal charges in an instance like this because these officers are both protected by just the thin blue line, right? It's almost impossible to get police officers to charge other police officers with things. And also, theoretically, he would have to overcome qualified immunity even in a civil case. Now, what he would be talking about here would be something about a federal civil rights violation, and there are some potential criminal penalties for that. But the most likely outcome that would potentially come of this would be a civil lawsuit, not a criminal action. And all he would have to do in order to proceed with that lawsuit is show that these officers should have known that what they were doing was violating his rights. Now, that is not always the easiest thing to do, but in the case of this interaction, given all of the Supreme Court precedent relating to profanity in public, gestures of speech, all of those kinds of things, these officers should have known that, and therefore they should lose qualified immunity if this young man decides to take it to court.
Okay, and then you can go from there if you want to see if you can press charges and whatnot if you
Perfect.
violated your rights.
Appreciate it.
Okay?
Stay
All
out
right,
of the
am I
roadway.
free to go?
Don't give us fingers.
Shut the fuck up.
Stay out of the roadway. Stop causing a public alarm.
Dude, shut the fuck up. Am I
Stop
free to go?
cursing.
Am I
You're free to go.
Stop cursing. Go fuck.
You're free to go.
If you enjoyed this interaction, you won't want to miss this video right here, where a well-known First Amendment auditor comes up against two different local police officers who he refers to as dumber than a bag of hammers.